Crystal restaurant shone like a jewel in the heart of the city. Polished marble walls, crystal chandeliers suspended from the high ceiling, and soft violin music composed the perfect setting for the occasion. Victoria, the only daughter of Edward, the construction magnate, celebrated her birthday surrounded by friends from high society. She wore a red dress that stood out among the other women, with jewels that sparkled with every movement of her head. Her black, straight and well-combed hair framed a face of delicate features that at that moment displayed a satisfied smile as she received compliments and expensive gifts. The waiters circulated with silver trays, serving champagne and elaborate dishes that exuded delicious aromas. Victoria raised her glass in a toast. "I thank you all for your presence on this special night. It's comforting to know that I am surrounded only by people who truly matter," she said in a melodious voice, receiving applause in response. Rain fell mercilessly on the street, turning sidewalks into mirrors of water. Leaning against the window, protected only partially by the small awning of the restaurant, was Michael. His brown eyes, large and expressive, observed the celebration through the foggy glass. He was only 8 years old, but his face already showed a seriousness that didn't belong to childhood. His clothes were soaked, stuck to his thin body, and his lips trembled from the cold he felt. His stomach ached with hunger. He hadn't eaten anything decent in days since his father had the accident, and he began sleeping in the hospital corridors. His shoes, too big for his feet and clearly second-hand, were soaked and heavy. His t-shirt, once white, now had a grayish tone. Michael took a deep breath, gathering courage as he thought about his father, who was in the hospital, fighting for his life. "Dad, I'll get food and help. I promise I won't come back with nothing," he whispered to himself, clutching in his pocket the last medical receipt he had received. At the main table of the restaurant, Victoria opened presents with theatrical enthusiasm. Boxes from famous jewelers, exclusive brand bags and imported perfumes accumulated at her side. Her friends, all dressed as if they were in a fashion show, applauded each new unwrapped gift. Champagne was served non-stop, and elaborate food dishes appeared and disappeared as the night progressed. A side table displayed a grand buffet with leftovers of practically untouched dishes, enough food to feed several families for days. No one seemed to notice the small figure who, after much hesitation, finally pushed the heavy door of the restaurant and entered timidly. The maitre d', busy with other clients, didn't see when Michael slipped inside, soaked, trembling and starving. The boy advanced slowly through the hall, with his eyes divided between the table full of food and Victoria, ignoring the strange looks he was beginning to attract. "Have you ever imagined what the less fortunate would do if they saw how much we spend in a single night?" commented one of Victoria's friends, serving himself more champagne without noticing the irony of his own words. Edward was sitting at a discreet table in the opposite corner of the restaurant. Unlike the young people present at his daughter's party, he wore a discreet grey suit, but impeccably cut. His face, marked by time and worries, seemed tired. His grey hair was well combed, and his observant eyes didn't miss a single detail of the environment. In front of him, a folder with documents and a cell phone. He had arrived without notice, planning to surprise his daughter, bringing a special gift. However, since he arrived, he had just been observing from afar, feeling a strange mixture of pride and disappointment at seeing Victoria's behavior with her friends. Edward took a sip of water, the only liquid on his table. "Sir, would you like to order now?" asked the waiter, approaching respectfully. "Not yet, I'm waiting for the right moment," Edward responded, without taking his eyes off his daughter's table. Michael advanced through the restaurant like a small castaway in a sea of luxury. With each step, he left small puddles of water on the polished marble floor. His stomach painfully growled as he smelled the aroma of food. The boy couldn't take his eyes off the almost untouched dishes on the buffet table. His heart was beating so hard, it seemed like it would jump out of his mouth. In his right hand, he firmly clutched a crumpled and damp paper, his father's medical diagnosis and the budget for the surgery that could save him. Howard, his father, had worked in construction for years but had never received adequate safety equipment. That morning, he had fallen from an improvised scaffold, suffering serious injuries that required urgent surgery. The doctors had been clear. Without the surgery, he wouldn't survive until dawn. Michael knew that Victoria was Edward's daughter, the owner of the largest construction company in the city. For the boy, asking for her help seemed to be the only hope. If I can get a little food and help for my father, maybe there's a chance, thought Michael, trying to control the trembling that took over his body and ignoring the dizziness caused by hunger. Victoria was laughing loudly, throwing her head back, when she noticed a strange movement approaching her table. Her smile instantly froze upon seeing the soaked and dirty child approaching. Michael stopped a few steps from the table, trying to find the right words. Silence settled in that corner of the restaurant, with all of Victoria's friends watching the unusual scene. The music continued playing, but it seemed distant now. Victoria frowned, her face assuming an expression of displeasure that she didn't try to disguise. She looked around, searching for some restaurant employee who could remove that intrusion from her perfect party. "Can someone explain to me how this boy managed to get in here?" asked Victoria, her cutting voice breaking the awkward silence that had settled. From the other side of the restaurant, Edward adjusted himself in his chair, suddenly attentive to the situation unfolding. His eyebrows furrowed as he observed the small soaked boy facing his daughter's icy gaze. There was something in the boy's posture that intrigued him, a silent dignity, despite the visibly desperate circumstances. Edward made a motion to stand up, but decided to wait, curious to see how the situation would unfold and, more importantly, how his daughter would react. He didn't recognize the boy immediately, but there was something vaguely familiar in his face, something that touched a distant memory he couldn't pinpoint. Perhaps this unexpected encounter will reveal the true character I've tried to cultivate in her, Edward murmured to himself with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Michael finally found his voice, which came out trembling and low, almost swallowed by the restaurant's spacious environment. He looked at the practically untouched plate of food in front of Victoria, and then at the damp paper in his hand, trying to hold it steady despite the trembling. "But please, Mom, I'm very hungry. I haven't eaten for days. Could you give me that plate that you're not eating?" His voice failed, but he continued, "And my father works for your father's company. He had an accident today and needs urgent surgery. The doctors said he won't survive without it." Tears mixed with rainwater on his face. Even so, he remained there, firm in his desperate plea, while Victoria's friends exchanged uncomfortable glances, and some even let out muffled laughs. First food, and now money? "How do you know who I am? Are you following me? Is this some kind of scam?" asked Victoria, alternating between disbelief and irritation. Victoria's expression transformed into a mask of disdain. She looked at the plate of food in front of her, and then at the extended paper, as if both were something contaminated. With a deliberate movement, she pulled the plate closer to herself, away from Michael, and then took a piece of bread, bit a small piece, and threw the rest in the trash beside her. A heavy silence took over the table, as everyone waited for her next reaction. For a very brief moment, something resembling compassion seemed to pass through her eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a calculated coldness. Instead of responding to the desperate request, Victoria took her glass of water and, with a gesture of indifference, pushed Michael away. The boy backed away, feeling rejected, while Victoria's friends observed the scene. The paper in his hand, his last hope, was now completely ruined, the ink blurring until the text became illegible. "This is for you to learn not to interrupt private parties with begging requests. If you want food, look for a shelter. Security guards exist for a reason," said Victoria, with a cruel smile forming on her made-up lips. At that exact moment, as if an invisible force had been activated, Edward rose from his table. His chair scraped on the floor with a noise that cut through the laughter like a knife. All eyes turned to him, including Victoria's, whose smile instantly vanished upon recognizing her father. Edward walked slowly through the restaurant, each step deliberate and firm, his expression impenetrable. Victoria's friends, realizing who was approaching, fell silent, some even adjusting themselves in their chairs like children caught in mischief. Michael remained motionless, droplets of water running down his hair and clothes, forming a small puddle under his feet, not understanding what was happening or who was this man who now approached with a presence that seemed to fill the entire room. "Father, what are you doing here?" Victoria asked, her voice losing all its previous arrogance and acquiring a childish tone that didn't match her earlier demeanor. Edward didn't answer Victoria's question. Instead, he turned to little Michael, who was shivering from cold and hunger, still stunned by the public humiliation. With a gentle gesture that contrasted with his severe expression, Edward removed his own coat and placed it over the boy's shoulders. Then, without saying a word, he took Michael by the hand and signaled for Victoria to follow them. The silence was deafening as they crossed the main hall of the restaurant. Victoria's friends, previously so animated, now observed the scene with a mixture of embarrassment and morbid curiosity. The waiters froze in their positions, holding trays in the air as if they were in a living painting. Edward led the small group to a private room at the back of the restaurant, an elegant space reserved for important meetings and conversations that required privacy. When the door closed behind them, the sound of music and conversations from the main hall completely disappeared. "Sit down, Michael. I'll ask them to bring food for you immediately," said Edward, his voice gentle with the boy while pressing a button on the wall to call a waiter. "As for you, Victoria, I never thought I'd see the day when I would be ashamed to call you my daughter." The reserved room was smaller than the main hall, but no less luxurious. A dark wooden table dominated the center of the space, with chairs upholstered in red velvet around it. Oil paintings of mountain landscapes decorated the walls, and a smaller but equally elegant chandelier hung from the ceiling. Michael sat timidly on the chair indicated by Edward, looking tiny on the imposing furniture. His eyes were still wide, alternating between Edward and Victoria, trying to understand the dynamics between father and daughter. Victoria remained standing, her posture defensive, arms crossed over her chest and chin raised in defiance. However, there was a subtle tremor in her lips that betrayed her nervousness. A waiter entered quickly, received Edward's instructions to bring hot food for the boy, and left as silently as he had entered. The older man then turned to his daughter, his dark eyes carrying a weight she had never seen before. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" "No, don't answer yet." Edward raised his hand when Victoria opened her mouth to speak. "Look at this boy, really look at him. He's wet, cold, hungry, and yet he had the courage to come in here alone to ask for help to save his father's life. And you, with all your privilege, couldn't show even the basic kindness that any human being deserves. Father, you don't understand. This boy invaded my party. He could be anyone trying to deceive us," Victoria replied, her voice losing conviction with each word. "How could I know he wasn't lying?" The waiter returned with a tray containing hot soup, fresh bread, and a glass of milk. Michael looked at the food, his eyes watery, but didn't dare touch anything until Edward gently nodded, giving him permission. The boy began to eat slowly, trying to be polite despite the hunger consuming him. Edward observed the scene for a moment, something in his gaze suggesting he was reliving distant and painful memories. When he turned to Victoria again, there was a hardness in his expression that made her involuntarily step back. He walked to the room's window, which overlooked a less privileged part of the city, visible only as a cluster of distant lights that contrasted with the nearby ostentatious brightness of downtown. "Do you see those lights far away, Victoria? There is the irregular settlement Riverside Heights. That's where I was born and raised. My mother worked cleaning rich people's houses during the day and sewing at night." Edward paused, his voice choked with emotion. "When I was approximately Michael's age, my mother fell ill. We had no money for medicine or doctors. One day she collapsed in the kitchen of a mansion where she worked. Do you know what the lady of the house did? She ordered that they take her away so she wouldn't die on her property and cause problems." The revelation hit Victoria like a slap. She had never heard this story before. Her father always avoided talking about his childhood, and she had never questioned the silence. The image she had of her family was of generations of wealth and power, not of poverty and struggle. Her mouth opened in shock as she tried to reconcile the powerful man before her with the poor boy from his story. Michael had stopped eating, also absorbed by Edward's narrative. The man continued, his voice gaining strength as the words flowed, as if a dam had finally broken after years of containment. "My mother died 3 days later. Victoria. Died of hunger and disease on the streets, because no one would help her. I was left alone wandering the streets, picking food from garbage bins, sleeping in alleys. I survived because a man, a stranger who owed me nothing, gave me a chance." Edward wiped away a solitary tear. Today, when I saw you deny food to a hungry child and publicly humiliate him, I saw the ghost of that rich woman who let my mother die. And that broke my heart more than you can imagine." The silence that followed was broken only by Michael's contained sobs, who now cried openly, probably thinking about his own father on the verge of death. Victoria had gone pale, her hands visibly trembling. She tried to approach her father, but he raised his hand again, keeping her at a distance. His eyes, previously filled with sadness, now shone with iron determination. He walked to where his daughter stood and, without warning, extended his hand. "Give me your keys, your credit cards, and your cell phone." "Now," Edward demanded, his voice leaving no room for discussion. "Today you're going to learn a lesson you should have learned a long time ago." "What? Dad, this is ridiculous." "It was just a misunderstanding, I didn't know," Victoria stammered, backing away. "Now, Victoria," Edward's voice thundered in the small room, making Michael shrink in his chair. "If you don't give them to me willingly, I'll call security to search your purse. The choice is yours." With trembling hands, Victoria opened her designer purse and handed over a set of keys, several credit cards, and her latest model phone. Edward took everything and stored them in the inner pocket of his jacket. His gaze was one of pure resolution, without a trace of the indulgence he had always shown toward his daughter's whims. He then took his own phone and made a quick call, speaking in a low voice. When he hung up, he turned to Michael, who had finished eating and was observing the situation with frightened eyes, but with more color in his face now. "Michael, I will personally ensure that your father receives the best medical treatment available. My driver is already on his way and will take you directly to the hospital," Edward explained, his voice softening as he spoke to the boy. "I will meet you there later, after resolving an important matter with my daughter." "Thank you, sir," Michael replied timidly, his gaze briefly shifting toward Victoria. "Do you think my father will be okay?" At that moment, the door to the room opened and a man in a dark suit entered respectfully. It was Edward's driver, a middle-aged man with a military posture and a serious expression. Edward whispered some instructions to him, who solemnly nodded before approaching Michael and offering his hand to the boy. With a last grateful look at Edward and another, indefinable one at Victoria, Michael followed the driver out of the room. When the door closed again, father and daughter were left alone in the now tension-filled environment. Edward walked to the chair where Michael had been sitting and collected his coat, placing it over his shoulders again. His expression was that of someone who had made a difficult but necessary decision. "From this moment, Victoria, you are disinherited," Edward announced, each word falling like a sentence. "I will not tolerate someone with your character inheriting the fruit of my work, built on principles that you clearly don't share or understand." "Disinherited? Dad, you can't be serious, because of a street boy who appeared out of nowhere," Victoria exclaimed, her voice rising an octave. "It's unfair, all of this is an overreaction." Edward ignored his daughter's protests. He moved toward the door, stopping only to make a gesture indicating that she should follow him. Victoria hesitated, but something in her father's expression told her there was no room for discussion. They left the private room and crossed the main hall, where the party continued, albeit in a more subdued tone. Victoria's friends observed in silence as father and daughter walked toward the exit, Edward in front, with determined steps, and Victoria following him like a scolded child. Outside the restaurant, the rain had diminished to a light drizzle, but the air remained cold and damp. A second luxury car was parked at the curb, with a driver standing next to the open rear door. "Get in," Edward ordered, pointing to the car. "We're going on an educational ride. Where are we going?" "Dad, this has gone too far," protested Victoria, crossing her arms. "You're treating me like a child." "You act like one, so I'll treat you as such until you learn to behave like a decent human being," replied Edward, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Get in the car. I won't ask again." The journey was made in oppressive silence. Victoria, sulking, looked out the window as the bright lights of downtown gradually gave way to darker, less maintained streets. The urban landscape visibly changed. Luxury buildings yielded to simpler constructions, then to improvised structures, until finally they were navigating narrow, poorly lit streets. The car moved slowly, avoiding potholes and piles of debris. Edward carefully observed his daughter's reaction, who now seemed genuinely apprehensive. her wide eyes registering a world she only knew through sensationalist news on television. After almost an hour of travel, the driver stopped in front of an area marking the entrance to the irregular settlement Riverside Heights, a cluster of simple houses and shacks that extended up the hill, with intertwined electrical wires forming a chaotic web over the constructions. "We've reached our destination," announced Edward, his voice somber as the car stopped. "Riverside Heights, the place where I was born, grew up, and saw my mother die. The same place where Michael and his father live." "You don't expect me to get out of the car here, do you?" asked Victoria, fear evident in her trembling voice. "This place isn't safe, Dad. We could be robbed, or worse." Edward opened the car door and got out, then gestured for Victoria to follow him. Reluctant and visibly frightened, she exited the vehicle, hugging herself due to the cold and fear. Night had now advanced with few people on the streets, but Victoria still felt exposed and vulnerable, without the status symbols that normally protected her, without her cell phone, without money, without her identity as a privileged daughter. Edward walked a few steps toward the entrance of the settlement, then turned to face her. "You will stay here, Victoria. You will spend the next 24 hours in this place," declared Edward, his voice resolute. "I want you to find where Michael and his father live and learn their story. I want you to see how those who work to build mansions, they can never live in actually live." "What? You're abandoning me here? Alone? At night?" Victoria's voice rose in genuine panic. "Dad, this is insane. You can't do this." "I can and I will," responded Edward, his expression unwavering. "When I was 10 years old, I was abandoned alone on the streets with no one to help me." "You are 25 years old, Victoria. It's time to grow up and understand the real world." The driver had gotten out of the car and was now standing beside Edward, expression impassive. Victoria looked from one to the other, realizing there was no way out. Tears of anger and fear began to run down her face, smudging her perfect makeup. She took a hesitant step toward her father, attempting one last plea. "Please, don't do this. I promise I'll change. I'll help the boy and his father. Just don't leave me here," she begged, her voice broken by crying. "I'll return tomorrow night at this same place," replied Edward, ignoring her pleas. "If you truly learn something during this time, if you really understand what I've tried to show you, then perhaps there's hope for you." Before Victoria could protest again, Edward turned and walked back to the car. The driver followed him, and in seconds the luxury vehicle disappeared into the night, leaving Victoria alone at the entrance to the irregular settlement. She remained motionless for a few moments, unable to believe what had happened. The reality of the situation slowly began to sink in. She was alone, without money, without a cell phone, in an unknown and potentially dangerous area. A shiver ran down her spine when she heard distant sounds of loud music and altered voices. Victoria looked around, desperate, trying to decide what to do. Her high-heeled shoes sank into the mud of the unpaved street, and her party dress seemed absurdly out of place in that setting. How could he do this to me? How could he abandon me here, she muttered to herself, as she began to walk hesitantly toward the nearest lights. I don't even know where to begin looking for that boy. Meanwhile, at the hospital, Howard's situation was rapidly deteriorating. Michael had arrived accompanied by Edward's driver, and immediately the doctors were informed that all expenses would be covered by the businessman. A medical team was mobilized, but complications soon arose. The responsible doctor, a middle-aged man with deep, tired circles under his eyes, called Michael for a conversation in a small room adjacent to the emergency area. The boy, still wearing the oversized coat that Edward had lent him, looked small and fragile in the plastic chair of the waiting room. "Michael, your father needs immediate surgery, but there's a complication," explained the doctor, trying to use simple words. "He's lost a lot of blood and needs a transfusion, but he has a very rare blood type. We're checking our blood bank, but we need to find a compatible donor quickly." "I can donate my blood," Michael promptly offered, extending his thin arm. "You can take all the blood you need, doctor." The doctor smiled sadly and explained that due to Michael's age, he couldn't be a donor. Besides, there was no guarantee his blood type would be compatible with his father's. The doctor then took Howard's medical chart and flipped through it, stopping at a note that caught his attention. It was a record from years ago, when Howard had gone through another medical emergency. Interesting, murmured the doctor, adjusting his glasses. It seems your father went through a similar situation a few years ago. At that time, he received a blood donation from a businessman, apparently, but the name is partially illegible. I can only see Emont. Mr. Edward, exclaimed Michael, jumping up from his chair. It's Mr. Edward. He said he would come to the hospital later. We have to wait for him. The doctor frowned thoughtfully. Edward Montgomery. The civil construction businessman? When Michael nodded vigorously, the doctor looked hopeful. That makes sense. If it's really him and if he's compatible, we can solve our problem. I'll try to contact him immediately. The doctor left the room and went to the nursing station, where he picked up the phone and dialed Edward's company number, obtained through a quick search. After a few minutes of conversation, his expression darkened. He hung up the phone and returned to where Michael was anxiously waiting. I tried to contact Mr. Edward, but I was informed that he's not available at the moment and his cell phone is turned off, explained the doctor, trying to hide his concern. We'll continue searching the blood bank, but I need to be honest with you, Michael. Time is running out. Michael remained silent for a few moments, processing the gravity of the situation. Then, with surprising determination for someone so young, he stood up and walked to the door. I'll find him, he declared firmly. I'll look for Mr. Edward and bring him to save my father. Michael, wait. You can't go out alone at this hour, protested the doctor, reaching him at the door. It's dangerous and you don't know where he is. My father will die if I do nothing, responded Michael, tears in his eyes, but determination in his voice. I have to try. While Michael was debating with the doctor about his intention to go out looking for Edward, Victoria was facing her own challenges in the dark streets of Riverside Heights. Her hesitant steps led her deeper into the irregular settlement. The rain had started again, now stronger, soaking her thin dress and making her hair stick to her face. The look she received from the few residents who were still on the streets at that hour varied between curiosity, mistrust, and, what scared her most, predatory interest. She knew she was an easy target, a woman alone, obviously out of place, dressed in expensive clothes. Every shadow, every noise made her jump. The cruel reality that her father had tried to show her was manifesting itself in the worst possible way. I need to find a place to shelter, thought Victoria, shivering from cold and fear. And tomorrow somehow I need to find out where that boy lives. How does my father expect me to survive until then? Victoria walked through the narrow streets of the irregular settlement, her high heels sinking into the mud with each uncertain step. The rain fell mercilessly, soaking her party dress that now weighed heavily on her trembling body. The weak lights from improvised lampposts barely illuminated the way, creating threatening shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. She hugged her own body in a useless attempt to protect herself from the cold. Her hair, once perfectly arranged, now fell in wet strands over her made-up face, where tears of fear mixed with rainwater. As she turned a particularly dark corner, Victoria noticed too late the group of 3 young men approaching quickly. Before she could react, they were around her, surrounding her like wolves surround prey. One of them, the tallest, smiled when he noticed the diamond earrings she was still wearing. Look what we have here. It seems the princess got lost from the castle, said the young man, circling around her like a predator. That dress must be worth more than I earn in an entire year. Why don't you share some of your wealth with us? Please, I have nothing to give you. My father left me here without money, without a phone, without anything, Victoria replied, her trembling voice betraying the panic she felt growing inside her. The young men surrounded Victoria with hostile intentions. In minutes, her purse and jewelry had been taken, leaving her frightened and vulnerable on the dark street. Victoria tried to fight, but was pushed hard, falling on her back in the mud while the robbers rummaged through her now empty purse. Frustrated at not finding money or a phone, they threw the expensive purse back at her with disdain. One of them advanced again with a threatening expression that made Victoria back away, fearing the worst. At that moment, an authoritative voice cut through the rainy night. That's enough. Leave this young lady alone before I call your parents. The voice belonged to an elderly woman who appeared at the corner, firmly holding an umbrella as if it were a weapon. Come on, go away now, or tomorrow I'll speak with your mothers. What happened to my life? Yesterday I was at my birthday party, surrounded by luxury and security, and today I'm thrown in the mud, robbed and almost... Victoria couldn't complete the thought, as she watched the young men quickly move away, throwing angry looks at the elderly woman who had interrupted their plans. The lady approached with surprisingly firm steps for someone her age. She was a small woman, with a face marked by deep wrinkles that seemed to tell stories of decades of hard work and worry. Her grey hair was tied in a simple bun, and she wore a modest dress covered by an apron. Despite her fragile appearance, there was an undeniable strength in her dark, penetrating eyes. She extended her hand to help Victoria get up from the mud, holding the broken umbrella over both of them in a protective gesture. "Come, girl, it's not safe to be on the street at this hour, especially dressed like that," said the lady, examining Victoria from head to toe. "You look like a goldfish swimming in shark waters. Come with me, my house is just over there." "How can I trust you?" asked Victoria, still sitting in the mud, the shock of the assault still reverberating in her body. "I don't know anyone here. I don't know who you are." The old woman laughed softly, a surprisingly warm sound on that cold and frightening night. Her eyes softened as she observed the pitiful state of the rich young woman. "My name is Grace. And you're right to be suspicious, but look at me. I'm just an old lady trying to prevent you from having an even worse night. Besides, what choice do you have? Stay here in the mud waiting for other bandits to appear?" Victoria hesitated only for a moment before accepting Grace's extended hand. With effort, she managed to stand up, feeling the heavy mud on her once elegant dress. Her high-heeled shoes were hopelessly ruined, so she removed them, preferring to walk barefoot on the wet street. She followed Grace in silence, feeling strangely vulnerable and grateful at the same time. After walking for a few minutes through increasingly narrow streets, they arrived at a small exposed brick house with a zinc roof and a worn wooden door. The place was simple, but unlike many structures around, it seemed solid and well-maintained. A small garden with some hardy plants decorated the entrance, protected by an improvised fence. "It's not much, but it's been my home for 40 years, said Grace with evident pride in her voice as she opened the door. "Come in. I'll get you some dry clothes and something hot to drink." "I never imagined I would end my birthday in a place like this," muttered Victoria, crossing the threshold and entering a world completely different from her own. The interior of Grace's house was as modest as the exterior, but surprisingly welcoming. A single main room served as living room and kitchen, with a curtain separating what Victoria assumed to be the bedroom. Everything was simple, but impeccably clean and organized. Photos in cheap frames decorated the walls, showing different generations of a family. A wooden table with 4 chairs occupied the center of the room, covered with a hand-embroidered tablecloth. On the old stove, a kettle began to whistle softly. Grace invited Victoria to sit down while she disappeared behind the curtain, returning moments later with folded clothes, a simple skirt and a cotton blouse, plus a towel worn from use. "Take a quick shower back there," instructed Grace, pointing to a door in the back that Victoria hadn't noticed before. "The water isn't hot, but it will get that mud off your body. Then we'll talk about what a young lady like you is doing alone in Riverside Heights in the middle of the night." "The bathroom. Is it inside the house?" Victoria asked without thinking, and immediately regretted it when she saw the expression on Grace's face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." 20 minutes later, Victoria was sitting at the modest table, wearing borrowed clothes that, although simple, were clean and dry. Her wet hair had been dried with a towel, and her face was free of smeared makeup. Grace placed a steaming cup of herbal tea and a plate with simple bread in front of her. The comforting aroma filled the room, making Victoria realize how hungry she was. Silently, she began eating small pieces of bread, watching Grace move around the kitchen with the efficiency of someone who knew every inch of the space. The elderly lady finally sat across from her, her wrinkled hands wrapped around her own cup of tea. "So, are you going to tell me how Edward Montgomery's daughter ended up alone on the streets of Riverside Heights?" Grace asked calmly, her eyes fixed on Victoria's. Seeing the young woman's surprised expression, she smiled. "Yes, I know who you are. That designer dress and the jewelry the boys stole were clues, but mainly, you have your father's eyes." "You know my father? How?" Victoria was genuinely surprised, placing the teacup on the table with a sudden movement that almost spilled the liquid. Did he really grow up here, like he said? On the wall behind Grace, Victoria noticed more photos. One caught her attention. It showed a group of construction workers all wearing helmets and uniforms. In the center of the photo, younger but unmistakable, was her father, Edward. Next to him, with his arm over his shoulder in a gesture of camaraderie, was a man who looked vaguely familiar. Grace followed Victoria's gaze and sighed deeply, getting up to take the framed photo. She placed it on the table between them, her index finger pointing to the two men in the center. "Your father and my son, Howard, at the inauguration of the construction company 20 years ago," Grace explained, her eyes clouded by distant memories. "They grew up together here in Riverside Heights, were like brothers. They started the company together, with borrowed tools and many dreams. Howard is the hardest working man I know, just as your father was." "Was? The man in the photo is Michael's father? The man who's in the hospital?" The questions came quickly from Victoria's mouth as she looked at the photo with renewed interest, finally understanding the connection. Grace nodded slowly, the sadness evident in her tired eyes. She moved the photo away and leaned back in her chair, as if the weight of the memories was almost physical on her fragile shoulders. "Michael is my grandson. Howard is my son. And yes, he is in the hospital now, fighting for his life." She paused, her eyes fixed on Victoria. "I don't know what you did to Michael tonight or why your father left you here, but there must be an important reason." The silence weighed between them for several minutes. Victoria felt a growing shame remembering how she had treated Michael just hours before. The hungry and desperate face of the boy returned to her memory, along with her own thoughtless cruelty. The contrast between that memory and the kindness Grace was showing, despite her obvious poverty, was overwhelming. She looked around the small house, noticing the signs of a life of hard work and dignity. The swept floor, the patched but clean curtains, the few pieces of furniture worn from use but well cared for. And the photos, so many family photos, including several of a smiling Michael at different ages. "My father left me here to learn a lesson," Victoria finally confessed, her voice low with shame. "I humiliated Michael when he came asking for help for his father. I denied him food and treated him as if he wasn't worthy of breathing the same air as me. My father saw everything and, well, said I had to understand where he came from, what it means to go hungry, to be afraid, to have nowhere to go." "Edward was always dramatic in his lessons," Grace commented with a slight smile, though her eyes remained serious. "But he's right. Some lessons can only be learned through experience." Meanwhile, at the hospital, the situation was critical. Michael had managed to escape the doctor's vigilance and was now running through the white antiseptic corridors, his small steps echoing on the linoleum floor. Edward's oversized coat still covered his shoulders, giving him the appearance of a small ghost wandering through the building. His desperate eyes examined every person passing by, looking for the man who had promised to return to help his father. Nurses and doctors rushed by, casting sympathetic glances, but they were too busy with their own emergencies to stop the determined boy. Michael only knew that he needed to find Edward. It was the only hope for his father. "Mr. Edward. Where is Mr. Edward? Please, has anyone seen Mr. Edward?" His childish voice echoed through the corridors, growing more frantic as time passed. "My father needs him, please." Upstairs in the VIP area of the hospital, doctors and nurses moved with silent efficiency around the stretcher where Howard lay. Monitors beeped at an alarming rate, indicating that his vital signs were rapidly weakening. Without the necessary blood for transfusion, the surgery had been postponed as long as possible, but now the doctors had no choice but to try, even with reduced chances. Dr. Richardson, an experienced surgeon with decades of practice, examined the results of the latest tests with a grave expression. He had done everything in his power to locate Edward, but without success. Time was running out, and he needed to make a decision. "Prepare the patient for surgery immediately," Richardson ordered, his voice calm but urgent. "We'll try to minimize blood loss and use the bank we have available, even if it's not the ideal type. It's our only option now. Doctor, his blood type is extremely rare. Without a compatible donor, the chances are minimal," said the head nurse, checking the final preparations. "Are you sure you want to proceed?" Back at the small house in Riverside Heights, Grace served more tea to Victoria while telling stories about Edward and Howard's childhood. She spoke of how the two boys had grown up together, sharing dreams and plans for the future. How they had worked on small construction jobs since their teenage years, saving every penny to one day open their own business. Victoria listened with growing attention, seeing her father in a completely new light. The powerful and distant man she knew was being replaced by the image of a hard-working and determined boy who had overcome impossible circumstances. What happened then? If they were so close, why is my father rich and Howard still works as a laborer? Victoria asked, genuinely curious. Life isn't always fair, child, Grace replied with a sigh. There was an accident on their first big project. Howard fell from a scaffold, just like what happened today. He spent months in the hospital, unable to work. At that time, the company was still small, struggling to survive. Your father took on more responsibilities, made new contacts, secured new contracts. When Howard finally recovered, the dynamic had changed. Edward had become the face of the company, the name on the contracts. My father pushed him out of the partnership, Victoria asked, shocked by the revelation. That doesn't seem like something he would do, especially after what you told me about his own childhood. Grace's expression was complex, mixing sadness, resignation, and a spark of pride. She adjusted herself in the chair, her wrinkled hands caressing the photo that still sat on the table. It's not that simple. Life is rarely black and white, child. Howard never wanted to fight for control of the company. He just wanted to work, take care of his family, do what he knew how to do. And your father. Well, he had vision, ambition. The company grew beyond what either of them could imagine. And Edward always made sure Howard had work, even when he wasn't in ideal physical condition. It's not what it should have been, but it was better than complete abandonment. Victoria stared at the photo again, seeing the young, hopeful faces of her father and Howard. The resemblance between Howard and Michael was undeniable now that she knew what to look for. She thought of the boy in the restaurant, so desperate to save his father that he had faced fear and humiliation to ask for help. She felt a wave of shame so intense it almost made her choke. The simple clothes she wore now, the humble house where she sat, the kindness of the woman before her, all of this formed a picture she had never been able to see from her privileged pedestal. I need to help, Grace, Victoria said suddenly, rising from her chair with newly discovered determination. I need to go to the hospital, see how Howard is, find Michael and my father. I need to fix what I did. As soon as dawn breaks, we can take the bus to the hospital, Grace replied, a gentle smile lighting up her tired face. But how do you plan to help without money, without a phone, without your contacts? Back at the hospital, Michael had managed to reach the VIP room's floor, determined to find Edward. A uniformed security guard blocked the corridor, his arms crossed and expression impassive. Michael tried to run past, but was easily stopped by the tall, strong man. His small hands pushed uselessly against the security guard's solid body, who held him by the shoulders, firmly enough to prevent him from advancing, but careful not to hurt him. Please, I need to find Mr. Edward. My father will die if I don't find him, shouted Michael, tears of desperation streaming down his childish face. He promised he would come. He has the blood my father needs. Calm down, kid. There's no Edward registered on this floor, replied the security guard, keeping his voice calm despite Michael's agitation. You can't be running through the corridors shouting. This is a hospital. The clash between the determined boy and the unwavering security guard continued for a few minutes, attracting curious glances from nurses and patients. Michael was about to try again to get past the man when he saw Dr. Richardson leaving the operating room. The doctor looked exhausted, his face marked by deep lines of concern. His coat showed signs of the difficult procedure, and his slumped shoulders indicated worrying news. Upon seeing Michael, the doctor hesitated briefly, then walked slowly toward him. The security guard finally released the boy, who ran to meet the doctor, his heart racing with fear. Doctor, did you manage to do the surgery? Is my father okay? Did you find Mr. Edward? The questions came out in a continuous, anxious flow. Richardson knelt down to be at Michael's eye level, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. His expression was one of deep compassion and regret. I'm sorry, little one. We did everything we could, but... His voice failed, unable to complete the devastating phrase. Michael's world seemed to freeze in that instant. The corridor, the people, everything disappeared, leaving only him and those terrible words hanging in the air. His small body began to shake uncontrollably, shock giving way to a pain so deep it felt physical. He opened his mouth to scream, to deny, to beg, but no sound came out. At that exact moment, a commotion erupted in the corridor behind them. Raised voices, hurried footsteps, the sound of someone arguing with staff. Richardson raised his head, surprised by the interruption. "I need to get in. You don't understand. It's an emergency." The female voice, determined and breathless, echoed down the corridor. "My name is Victoria, Edward Montgomery's daughter, and I need to see Howard immediately. Will it be too late? What happened to my father? Why is she here?" thought Michael, turning slowly toward the source of the commotion, his tears blurring his vision of the unlikely figure approaching at a run. All eyes in the hospital corridor turned to the unlikely figure advancing with determination. It was Victoria, almost unrecognizable, without makeup, disheveled hair, wearing simple clothes worn from use, and feet in old sandals much too big for her. Beside her walked Grace, small but firm, her wrinkled hand holding the young woman's arm as if guiding her. Victoria carried a worn cardboard folder, clutching it to her chest as if it contained the most precious of treasures. Her face, normally perfect and composed, was marked by fatigue and urgency. The two women had traveled in a crowded bus for almost an hour, then run several blocks to the hospital, and finally convinced, or rather intimidated, the receptionist to inform them where Howard was. Now, seeing Michael standing next to the doctor with a devastated expression, Victoria felt her heart tighten. "Michael! Thank God we made it!" shouted Victoria, quickening her steps and ignoring the security guard's protests. "Doctor, please don't tell me we're too late. I have vital information about Howard." "Who are you and how do you know my father?" asked Michael, confused and suspicious, wiping his tears with the backs of his hands. "You're the mean woman from the restaurant. Why are you here?" Victoria stopped a few steps from the boy, suddenly uncertain how to explain everything that had happened in the last few hours, how to ask forgiveness for her previous cruelty. Grace, noticing her hesitation, stepped forward. With the dignity of someone who has lived many years and seen much suffering, the elderly woman approached Michael and placed her hands on his small shoulders. Her eyes, so similar to her grandson's, conveyed calm and reassurance. "Michael, my dear grandson, this young woman spent the night in our home. She learned a lot about our family and about your father," Grace said softly. "And more importantly, she is here to help." Turning to the doctor, who was watching the scene with evident perplexity, she asked directly, "Doctor, tell us the truth. Is my son dead?" "No, ma'am, but we're losing him," responded Dr. Richardson, his grave face revealing the weight of the situation. "We were about to perform the surgery without the adequate blood, but the chances are minimal. We tried to locate Edward Montgomery, who apparently was a compatible donor in the past, but we couldn't." "He's alive!" exclaimed Michael, a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety in his childish voice. "But we need to find Mr. Edward now." "Please, bad lady, do you know where your father is?" Dr. Richardson looked from Victoria to Michael, trying to understand the dynamics between them. His decades of medical experience hadn't prepared him for the unusual scene unfolding before him. The daughter of one of the richest men in the city, dressed like a humble person, accompanied by an elderly woman who was apparently the grandmother of the boy whose father was fighting for his life. The tension in the air was palpable, charged with complex emotions and stories he was unaware of. Before he could intervene, Victoria stepped forward and, to everyone's surprise, knelt down to be at eye level with Michael. "Michael, I know I don't deserve your forgiveness for what I did at the restaurant. It was cruel, unforgivable, and I'm deeply ashamed," she said, her voice trembling with genuine emotion. "But I want to help your father now. Your grandmother showed me the truth about our family history, and I brought documents that could make a difference. What documents are these that could replace the blood Howard desperately needs?" asked the doctor, his professional tone not hiding his skepticism. "We need a compatible donor in the next few hours, or we'll have to risk surgery without the ideal blood." With trembling fingers, Victoria opened the worn folder that Grace had found in an old chest at home. Inside were time-yellowed documents, contracts, records, photographs. She removed the photo she had seen on the wall of Grace's house, the one showing her father and Howard Young, smiling, with arms over each other's shoulders in front of a small construction office. Next to the photo was an official-looking document, with both their signatures clearly visible at the bottom, a partnership contract. Victoria showed them to the doctor and Michael, her hands still trembling with the weight of the revelation. "Look, Michael, your father and mine weren't just friends or employer and employee. They were partners. They founded the company together," explained Victoria, pointing to the signatures. "Your father shouldn't have been working on dangerous scaffolding. He should have been in the office, making decisions alongside my father. Something went very wrong along the way, and I want to fix it. My mother used to say that Daddy was very important before the accident," said Michael, his large eyes fixed on the documents with curiosity and understanding beyond his years. "She said he built entire buildings, not just worked on them." At that moment, the distinctive sound of the elevator arriving at the floor caught everyone's attention. The metal doors opened slowly, revealing the tall and imposing figure of Edward. He seemed to have aged years in a single night. His face was pale, deep dark circles marked his eyes, and his normally impeccable posture was slightly bent, as if carrying an invisible weight. Seeing the group gathered in the hallway, he momentarily stopped, surprised to find his daughter there, dressed as he had never seen her before. His tired eyes scanned each face, Victoria, Michael, Grace, the doctor, before taking decisive steps toward them. "Father, how did you find us? How did you know we were here?" asked Victoria, rising quickly, the folder of documents still clutched in her hands. "We're desperately trying to locate you. Howard needs you. My driver informed me that he dropped Michael off here last night. When I couldn't locate him at Grace's house this morning, I imagined he would be at the hospital," Edward replied, his deep voice carrying a fatigue he rarely showed. "And you, Victoria, I see you've met Grace." This wasn't in my plans, but perhaps it was better this way. Without waiting for a response, Edward approached Michael and, to everyone's amazement, knelt before the boy. It was an almost surreal image, the powerful businessman in his expensive though wrinkled suit on his knees before a poor child. With a gentleness few knew he possessed, he placed his hands on Michael's small shoulders, looking directly into his eyes. There was so much to say, so many years of silence and neglect to explain, but words seemed insufficient given the urgency of the moment. "Michael, I came to help your father. I ask forgiveness for what I did to him, for what I didn't do for him all these years," said Edward, his voice broken by contained emotion. "I have the same rare blood type as him, and I came to make the donation that will save his life. It's the least I can do after so long. Will you save my father? Really, do you promise?" Michael's eyes shone with renewed hope, his small hands holding Edward's with surprising strength. "I don't want to be alone, sir. He's all I have since Mum went away." Dr. Richardson, who had observed the scene with growing amazement, finally intervened with the urgency of someone who knows the value of every minute in critical situations. His white coat rustled as he moved quickly to Edward's side, already mentally calculating the next steps necessary for the blood donation procedure and the subsequent surgery. His previously defeated expression now showed the renewed determination of a doctor who glimpses a possibility of success. "Mr. Montgomery, if you really have the same blood type, we need to act immediately," said the doctor, gesturing for a nurse to approach. "The blood typing will need to be confirmed, but if compatible, we can start the transfusion and surgery within the next hour. Do whatever is necessary, doctor." "I'm at your disposal," replied Edward, standing up and already removing his jacket. "How much blood will you need? I'll take all the necessary vitamins and supplements to replenish as quickly as possible." The following hours passed in a blur of intense activity. Edward was taken for quick tests that confirmed his blood compatibility with Howard. The donation was made immediately, and the medical team mobilized with renewed efficiency for the emergency surgery. Victoria, Grace, and Michael waited in the waiting room, an unlikely trio united by shared anxiety. The rich young woman and the humble elderly lady sitting side by side, occasionally exchanging words of comfort, while Michael alternated between periods of nervous restlessness and moments of exhaustion when he briefly fell asleep on his grandmother's lap. Through the high windows, they watched the day slowly progress, the morning sun giving way to the intense brightness of midday, and finally, to the orange hues of evening. Dr. Richardson appeared periodically for brief updates, his face gradually relaxing as the surgery progressed positively. I never imagined I would be sitting in a public hospital, wearing borrowed clothes, waiting for news about the man who should have been my father's partner. Victoria reflected quietly, more to herself than to Grace. How blind I've been for so long. How did I not realize the true value of people beyond money and status? Life has strange ways of teaching us its most important lessons, child, replied Grace, her voice tired but serene. Some learn through pain, others through loss. You are learning through compassion, and that is a precious gift. Finally, when the first stars began to dot the night sky, visible through the hospital windows, Dr. Richardson appeared in the hallway. His tired but broad smile said everything even before his words confirmed what his eyes were already announcing. The three, Victoria, Grace and Michael, rose simultaneously, united by the same invisible thread of hope. The surgery was a complete success, announced the doctor, allowing himself to visibly relax. The blood donated by Mr. Montgomery was exactly what we needed. Howard is stable, and although recovery will be long, we believe it will be complete. Can I see my father? Please, doctor, I need to see my father, begged Michael, grabbing the doctor's coat with desperation mixed with joy. I need to tell him about everything that happened. Soon, Michael. He's still in recovery and needs to rest, the doctor explained gently. But I promise that as soon as possible you'll be the first to enter to see him. 2 weeks later, an unusual meeting was taking place in Edward's spacious hospital room. Howard, still pale but visibly recovering, was sitting in a comfortable armchair that had been brought specially for him, with Michael proudly standing by his side, like a small guardian. Grace observed everything from a chair in the corner, her eyes shining with contained tears. Victoria, now back in elegant but considerably more discreet clothes than her previous style, was sitting close to her father. Edward, recovered from the blood donation, took his position at the head of the improvised table, where several documents were carefully arranged. The company lawyer was finalizing the last details, verifying that everything was correct before discreetly withdrawing, leaving the family, for that was what they had become, alone for the significant moment that was about to happen. Before we sign these documents, I want everyone to understand what they represent, began Edward, his voice carrying the seriousness of the moment. It's not just about money or company shares. It's about correcting a mistake I made 20 years ago, when I allowed ambition and circumstances to separate a partnership that should have remained strong. Edward, you don't need to do this, Howard interrupted, his voice still weak but determined. I always understood why things happened that way. I never held any resentment. And that's exactly why you deserve this, more than anyone I know, Edward replied, a genuine smile softening his normally serious features. These documents officially recognize that you were a co-founder of the company. I'm transferring 25% of the shares to your name and another 10% to a fund in Michael's name for his education and future. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion, Howard clearly speechless, Grace silently wiping tears with a worn handkerchief, Michael alternating confused and amazed looks between the adults, trying to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. It was Victoria who broke the silence, rising with a new and genuine confidence that no longer derived from her surname or bank account, but from a deep inner transformation. I also have an announcement to make, she said, looking first at her father, who nodded encouragingly. I've decided to use my portion of the inheritance to found a free hospital in the Riverside Heights settlement. A place where no one else will need to choose between food on the table or medical treatment, where children like Michael won't have to beg for help to save their parents. A hospital? In our community? Asked Grace, her face lighting up with hope and disbelief. So many lives could be saved, so many diseases prevented. It will be the first of many if I can achieve this dream, Victoria replied, her determination evident in the firmness of her voice. And I would like Howard to oversee the construction once he's recovered. No one knows the real needs of the community better. Michael, who had listened to everything with growing attention, suddenly moved away from his father's side and ran to the small school backpack he had kept close since the beginning of this extraordinary journey. Everyone watched curiously as he rummaged inside it, finally removing something wrapped in a worn napkin. With determined steps, the boy walked up to Victoria and extended the small package to her. "This is for you," said Michael, his large, sincere eyes fixed on Victoria's surprised face. "It's the rest of the bread I tried to share at the restaurant. I kept it to remember that we shouldn't waste food, but now I want you to have it." Victoria took the napkin with trembling hands, unwrapping it to reveal a piece of hard, slightly moldy bread. At any other moment in her previous life, she would have recoiled in disgust. Now, however, she understood the symbolic value of that simple piece of bread. It wasn't just food, it was forgiveness. It was a circle closing. It was a lesson about sharing that she had finally learned. Tears flowed freely down her face as she hugged Michael, the little hero who had triggered all this transformation. "Thank you, Michael. This is the most precious gift I've ever received," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "I promise I'll never forget what you taught me." A year later, an excited crowd gathered in front of the new Hope Community Hospital, modern and welcoming, which stood out in the landscape of Riverside Heights. Victoria, in a simple but elegant suit, stood beside Michael, now taller and well-dressed. Behind them, Edward and Howard watched with pride, now officially partners as they always should have been. Grace, seated in a chair of honor in the front row, smiled radiantly. "Ready for our big moment?" asked Victoria, offering Michael one end of the ceremonial scissors. "This hospital exists because of you." "No, it exists because we learned to share what we have, whether it's bread, blood, or money," replied Michael with wisdom beyond his years. Together, they cut the ribbon to enthusiastic applause. The hospital doors symbolically opened for everyone, without social distinction. At the entrance, a framed photograph caught attention. It showed a boy offering a piece of bread to an elegant young woman. Below, a plaque read, "Sometimes the greatest wealth is in learning to share." "I never imagined that denying a plate of food to a hungry boy would lead me to build a hospital," Victoria reflected. "And sometimes we need to lose everything to discover what really matters," Edward responded, embracing his daughter with genuine pride. "You learned through compassion, and that is a precious gift." Did you enjoy Victoria and Michael's story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like and comment where you're watching from. Oh, and there's another story waiting for you here on the screen. Click there and I'll be waiting for you.